I can draw us all back together, we'll start our last session. Anne, do you want to?
I'm going to sit here and drink my water.
Okay. So thanks to all of you for that amazing work. I'm excited to see what the other groups did. We will hear from Breakout Group 1, Breakout Group 2, and Breakout Group 3, and then we will have an informal discussion to wrap things up before the party, to which you are all invited. So Breakout Group 1, very quickly, we were very fortunate to have people in the room who'd been involved in the Department of Defense's response to the study instruction. And I won't take the time necessarily to go through this, this slide in detail, but the top line messages were that it's clear that any way forward in a study like this has to go two directions. And so understanding asymmetries in the global food system that are relevant to the Department of Defense is crucial, as is understanding the ways in which attacks on the Department of Defense could occur through the global food system. We talked about the use of the word vulnerability in the law and extended it to a formal consideration of the word threat. We also had an amendment from a colleague in finance who suggested actually, rather than food, the term soft commodities is important and snaps onto other communities that use data about these soft commodities. And let's see. Then there was two comments from our colleagues at the War College. The first is that if we were to think about the global food system, the U.S. food system, and building resilience into the U.S. food system, how would that prioritize actions taken from the with relevance to the DoD? So if we were to say there are ports that are highly concentrated, maybe those are special vulnerabilities, so relatively few actions can secure those areas. Would that be a way to prioritize interventions? The last point I'll make, which is a great segue to, I hope, to Breakout Group 2, is the strong interplay between this type of study and wargaming was noted. There are tremendous capabilities in this room and beyond for the use of wargaming, but in fact, this is a problem shape that is not so familiar to those who are wargaming. So it has to be a dialogue back and forth, and some of us can't wait to volunteer for the red team for that.
That was a great report back for 1. Thank you, Molly. For Group 2, we had excellent moderation thanks to Peter, even though I could not find him initially, using the Socratic method to talk us through what it means to model complexity when there's a lot of complexity in terms of the stakeholders involved, the information that's needed, and the data as well, and dealing with a lot of knowns and unknowns on all three of those sort of categorical issues. So in terms of decision-making requirements, we talked a lot about the role of the private sector and also networks like networks of farmers, potentially citizen scientists, and also the traditional decision makers coming from government and public policy communities. We primarily focused on domestic stakeholders, but also discussed international bodies like the UN and some pioneering work that the UN is doing in this area. We noted that each authority should be respected. These authorities derive power from their constituents, whether it's taxpayers, whether it's members of a professional association, or whether it's consumers. And any trust that brings people together should be a network of networks more than a formal institution with a new mandate and formal decision-making authority because really we emphasize very strongly that existing authorities should be respected. And therefore, you're working towards things like the establishment of shared norms over any sorts of legal rights, and focusing on stakeholder identification and coordination as key priorities so that you can mobilize these people to respond when a response is needed. The second thing we discussed is models. Had a great presentation there about the different tools needed to make decisions, and that these need to be prescriptive, not just descriptive, and that different events will require different models. We talked about the idea of a cloud or a collection of models that could all be tweaked depending on situational needs, and discussed how co-design is increasingly used as a tool in the modeling community to bring in relevant domain expertise. These models will probably need to be developed by different companies or academic communities as opposed to having one person do everything. And then finally, we connected those two things by talking about how to bring together information to enable good decision making. We talked about the need for quantitative data and modeling, saying that it's ideal if it's all in an integrated place, but really you need to know where it is. You need to be able to find it and mobilize it when necessary. And then we also talked about qualitative information, including case studies and stories, stressing that collecting information on what doesn't work and what has not worked in the past is just as critical as collecting successful case studies.
So we kind of did our breakout. The way we set it up is as a dialogue. So we started with 3 states, well, 2 states and Puerto Rico, and looked at on the ground, because this was the ground truth breakout. What does this all mean? What are you looking at on the ground? So we asked a representative from Idaho, someone who worked in Puerto Rico and Wisconsin, to say, okay, what is it that you're thinking about? What are you worrying about when it comes to food, when you're preparing for some disaster or catastrophe in particular? And what kind of actions are you taking to mitigate it, and what gaps do you have? And so that the idea was that dialogue, which didn't take place in the very neat way I had structured it, but took place as a conversation, which is as it should have been, was the idea was then also get the response from the federal agencies who were in the room, who had reported out right before then about what DHS S&T is looking at, and what FEMA and CISA, but CISA wasn't there. We also had someone representing the insurance industry, which was very helpful because we had a very healthy discussion on insurance and the inadequacy of current insurance, which I don't think we covered there, but it was a whole discussion that led to, however, the conclusion that that's just one factor, so it's not a be-all and end-all, but it's an important factor in looking for new insurance. So some of what we came out of this with is that we're not really thinking about data. First of all, we're not really collecting data, and moreover, we're not, even when we are collecting data, getting the whole data picture. We're not thinking about it correctly. So one of the examples is that if something happens in Idaho that affects Idaho's ability to produce food or to export food, we're not thinking about the consequences of the lack of the ability to export that food on who they're exporting to. So we're not thinking about the cascading impact on the larger economy and the larger agricultural sector, and we're not even thinking about how to collect that data. And yet that data, when you're starting to think about the food system as a whole, we have to think about. And so I know that as a consequence of this, there was some discussion about how we go and do that. We also looked at people make poor decisions when it comes to risk. And this came from a single comment and then broadened out. And the single comment was, the question was, do you consider the use of tornado warning systems as part of building resilience in a community? Simple question. The answer, and the reason for that is because there is and the example was there was a tornado warning. People chose to ignore it, despite the fact that there's a tornado warning, and the reason you put those systems in place is so people can act on them. And that got broadened out to a larger discussion on how people think about risk and generally make poor decisions, which get reinforced because they're thinking of it not just only individually, but socially. And people will come with social experiences. Well, you know what? Last time we had this warning, nothing happened in my house. Oh yeah, nothing happened in my house either, so the heck with it. And so you have this reinforcing poor decision making. I always use the example of people who, no matter what you do, and I've had this discussion with senior people at USGS, no matter what warnings you give people, people tend to have this, not everybody, but there are people who tend to drive into floods even though there's a likelihood they're going to drown. And why do they make those decisions? And it's kind of the same dynamic. So,
and can I just add, like, right after our discussion, we hadn't even left the room, everybody's phones start to buzz. Tornado warning, seek shelter immediately. We just had the conversation, we're all like, yeah, I mean,
Right.
we're in a government building.
And we went to look for a window. So
and there was no single authority who told you to go and seek shelter, right? Once you get on a warning, that doesn't help you that much. It's not authoritative, really. And you have so many experience. I mean, I know from my office, I used to get these warnings all the time, and we did do what they said to do because we had a system in place to do it. So we were socially reinforcing that. So anyway, so that was part of it. Another part was where we talked about, we went from discussion from a state that doesn't get that many disasters to a discussion of the catastrophe that happened in Puerto Rico and the lack of government response and the I'll say inadequacy of government response. And that led to a discussion that was reinforced through a review of some of the innovations that Wisconsin has taken using the co-op system on how you need to work with, you can't just rely on government. And you frankly can't just rely on, say, faith-based organizations or NGOs, but they're an important part of the equation. The key part of the equation that has to really be paid attention to in a different way than it has is the private sector. Because the private sector is going to drive the response and recovery anyway, and we're not really thinking about them where they are, what they're using. So if you take the experience of my own personal experience working in many disasters and working with the private sector, historically all we ask for, we want to know what big box stores are open, we want to know when Walgreens is opening up, we want to know when Target, because that's where people get supplies. But we're not looking at actually the whole economy and the rest of the private sector in terms of not only what they can supply, but what the effect is on them. And FEMA's new strategy is about flipping that relationship. And I think Eugene had mentioned, who spoke for FEMA earlier, you know, the need to sometimes just FEMA needs to get out of the way. So we talked about looking at that whole approach differently and engaging with them differently. And there are some agencies out there, actually at the state level, who are developing new tools to help do that, which is private sector to private sector mutual aid, and they're just facilitating. They're not owning it, they're just facilitating it. The other part of that is understand how communities function and where people naturally turn to for support, and let's strengthen those relationships and let's institutionalize those. Because if we strengthen them, that will help us with response and mitigation. And then just mention that the two biggest factors in disaster response are means, in other words, whether you have actually the means to do anything, and connectiveness, if you can organize it, if you can facilitate, if you can get somebody to say, go down into that storm shelter. So that was pretty much it. There was some good after action kind of discussion that came right after the meeting, but we'll follow that up in the report.
Okay. So now I'll invite our last group of people up. We were going to invite Sherry Ekstrom from American Family to come on up. David Bray from People-Centered Internet, and my cousin, more like my brother, Bob Woodruff, who's going to come up and help us do a professional job of this. This isn't exactly fireside, will it be? But that's okay. Before I forget, I want to call your attention to these very delicious mints that Refinitiv brought. They're on the table right around to the left, and you should absolutely help yourselves, with our thanks to Refinitiv for putting this all together. So this is pretty fun because I don't normally get to do this with him. But Bob.
Hello, Molly.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Nobody
and with
knows
all
our
my
story.
friends, right?
About our relationship. We never dated, that's
So,
for sure.
why don't
Because she's my cousin.
why don't you tell us why you're here?
Why am I here? One is my, I think since I was about 5 years old, Molly and I, who about the same age, grew up just outside of Detroit, and she was the cousin who's really become a total sister for us. She was the brilliant young scientist who would invent things when she was in kindergarten. So our respect had been close. Our love for each other has been huge over the years. And I thought about this actually being here today, is that when you and I were there and the suburbans are right outside Detroit, we didn't have to worry about starvation. We didn't have hunger. We didn't really witness wars or live in violence or the kinds of crises that we're living through now. And who would have ever thought that you would be someone who'd become a master in food, and I would be one that would travel around covering wars as a journalist for ABC and other places. And so this kinds of tragedies that were never in our backyard had became suddenly in our backyard, and certainly one that we deeply believe that it has become really the most important, both in terms of media, information, science, inventions, dealing with risk. I think it's one of the most important things in the world right now. And I think anybody who's been around the world, as I have, about 130 countries now, I think you're seeing a world that is changing and needs to be dealt with. I remember I talked to some today. I certainly talked to David and to actually Bob earlier about, we can't just sacrifice things and not just stop consuming so much or don't pollute so much. We need to invent something new. We need to do this with science, and I just have a lot of respect for everybody here as well. Not only those who have to deal with crisis in terms of changes people's attitudes and have the system set up so it can respond faster, but I think just generally this is the group that needs to be working together. That's what I've learned from her and a lot over these years.
And I think a tremendous benefit to all of us in this room has come from the space between Bob and me. Bob did not mean to get his head blown off. That was an accident.
Well, actually, I don't know
Although
if
if
you
you
know
ride
the story
around in
about this, but-
Iraqi tanks,
Yes, I was covering in Iraq for the seventh time I've been to Iraq actually twice during Hussein was still in power there, but 5 times after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. First time I embedded twice with the military. One was the Marines on the invasion into Iraq in 2003, and then the second time I was embedded with the 4th Infantry of the Army. And we were hit by an IED while we were in a mid-operation together with the Iraqi military as well, with the U.S. forces. And we were going down a road, and this IED exploded about 20 feet off to the left. And we were hit by a very powerful bomb that knocked me out I was unconscious for 36 days. And so that was what we knew was changing for us too. I miraculously woke up. Had significant brain injury and still have lots of memory problems, but I did survive. And everyone said this was 3 years earlier, medically and technically. I would never been saved. So I've seen those kinds of advances, and people say that in terms of medicine is one of the few things that improves because of wars. And so I did survive and live through that. And I saw really the country of Iraq changing too, from the moment that Saddam Hussein was put down and to today.
and so as a result of that horrific episode shared by, sadly, so many other families, Bob and his family, our family, has built a foundation that, among other things, focuses on initially on research on traumatic brain injury, and has attracted a number of supporters from across the military, people of all different political persuasions. And so as my work moved more and more in this direction, those relationships, Bob's relationships with the military and the intersection between us has become more and more important. And in fact, that was how General Dempsey came to get that study instruction passed. So I hope one theme from today will be the ways in which partnership and our dedication to each other in both obvious and less obvious ways will be probably our only hope, but certainly our best way forward. With that, I'd like to introduce David Bray and invite David to reflect a little bit on how he came here and who he is. He'll introduce
Who I
him.
am. Well, first, how I came here, I believe the myth is it was a stork, but I think there's another origin story there. My name's David Bray. I am the executive director for what's called the People-Centered Internet Coalition. We do demonstration projects that measurably improve people's lives using the internet. I've known Molly for almost about 10 years now. I believe it was a few days before Christmas, you came to what was jokingly referred to the ugliest building on K Street that has since been torn down. The outside said Federal Mediation and Reconciliation, which they did do. They did union disputes, but it also had 3 floors that were a secure facility, and so someone had to jokingly had a sense of humor because they put the information sharing environment for counterterrorism in the building that was Federal Mediation and Reconciliation. But anyway, and so I was doing at the time, I was a nonpartisan senior executive dealing with information sharing for counterterrorism purposes. And you came by, and the political appointee handed you off to me, and we ended up having a great conversation about the Federalist Papers and the nature of can representative democracy thrive in a rapidly changing world that is accelerating? And this was 2009. And I had come back from Afghanistan. I had not actually had a chance to be in Iraq, but I was in Afghanistan. And the thing that I would say, interestingly now, that might be a lens is I heard already some people talking about how we humans are really bad at judging risk and bias. I would submit that history is probably going to look back and say our brains were not ready for the internet, let alone artificial intelligence, let alone a lot of these technologies we are putting out. And a lot of the pathologies we're now seeing, especially in open societies, are just human nature playing into, unfortunately, tribalistic tendencies, polarization, social wedges, things like that. And when I was in Afghanistan at the time, I was there to think differently on anything. I basically had carte blanche to talk to NATO, talk to U.S. forces, talk to humanitarian efforts. And one of them was we had a really serious misinformation problem. And at the time, this was 2009, if you ask the average Afghan as to why the U.S. was in Afghanistan, more than 90% would say we were there because the heroin was so valuable, we wanted it for ourselves. And you would say, no, look, we're destroying it. They're like, oh, no, that's just for show. You're just making it look like you're destroying it, or you're doing it to drive up the price. And so I find it interesting that now, more than a decade later, misinformation in Afghanistan has now come to Europe and the United States. And we're actually behaving more tribalistically ourselves. At the same time, it's also worth remembering Afghanistan's history. It used to be producing more food than it actually received. It was actually a breadbasket for Central Asia. Now that's no longer the case. Unfortunately, when the Soviets went in the 70s, they destroyed irrigation. That destroyed then the ability to actually produce crops. And one of the few crops that were left to be produced is poppies. And so it's an interesting analog for what happens when societies start to erode and they lose the ability to support their agriculture, to support their way of life, and where it goes to. And hopefully it's not where we'll be 10 years from now going forward. But I think with Molly, it really is, if our brains were not ready for the interconnectedness of the world we are creating digitally and technologically, can we create a better science that can both, one, explain the interconnectedness? So think about how do we produce those models? How do we do the mathematics of that? How do we share that data? And then two, unfortunately, the other thing is we know humans are not motivated by facts. They're not motivated by data. In fact, it all shows that we all have confirmation bias, and the moment you've made up your mind to believe something, more facts will not change your opinion. It'll actually just make you lock in. And so if we're dealing with these issues of climate change or food stability, we're going to need a combination of both accurate data and facts, but also accurate stories that are non-dystopian. Because if right now I would actually say we have a wealth of dystopian narratives, but we have a dearth of non-dystopian narratives of what 2030 looks like, and in that absence, someone else will fill that vacuum.
And actually, I specifically remember David talking to me about networks that you were constructing. Time was in a small town, there was a bowling league, and people of all different parties and different kinds of jobs would go bowling. And so maybe, David, you can describe a little bit about some of the innovations you've put into place. He's known as the most social chief information officer in the world.
For whatever good that means. Yeah, I had that euphemism for a while. So it basically is just recognizing that. So I signed up in 2000 with a little program called the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. We were only 30 people in a 15,000 person organization. And every 6 months, Congress said we didn't need to exist. They said the Cold War is supposedly over. Why do we need to have bioterrorism preparedness? And for those of you who know me, it was actually scheduled weeks in advance that we would give a briefing on September 11th, 2001 at 9 o'clock in the morning as to what we would do technology-wise should a bioterrorism event happen. 8:34, briefing is canceled. We pile computers in the cars because that was information sharing at the time as you physically carry the computer. Set up an underground bunker, deal with the response to 9/11, don't sleep for 3 weeks. Down on October 1st, gave that briefing on October 3rd, flew back to Atlanta, and the first case of anthrax showed up in Florida 24 hours later. And it was interesting, the public health professional that spotted anthrax had only been briefed in August of 2001 as to how to recognize anthrax. Just interesting story. But that, after seeing that, then we later had West Nile the year later. We had severe acute respiratory syndrome in 2003. We had monkeypox. We had some ricin events. And I would say I kept on seeing what I would say lessons incurred, but not lessons learned, which is hierarchies are very good at efficiency and consistency across the units, but they are awful at adaptation to turbulent environments. And that's what motivated me to get a PhD. At the time, I looked at schools of public policy, and they said, that's great, but we don't care about technology. I looked at schools of engineering, and they said, that's great, but we don't care about people. And it actually ended up being in a business school where they actually were interested about bringing the two together. And that's actually what later then led me to do my postdocs up at MIT and Harvard, and then find myself in Afghanistan, because it was a case of, again, information flows, and can we adapt to that? And so I've tried to put in practice the idea that you can't just rely on organizational hierarchies to be adaptive to a rapidly changing world. It is all about creating networks that involve both trusted individuals that you've met before and had face-to-face relationships with, but also thinking about in this era in which we're getting more and more devices on the planet. I mean, there's now at least 4 times as many network devices on the planet as there are humans. About 33 billion network devices relative to 7.6 billion human beings. That's estimated in the next 6 years to be 75 billion on up, relative to the 8 billion human beings. And so could we create networks of both humans but also semi-autonomous or autonomous devices that could help feed in this sort of citizen science that can give us more situational awareness as to when we need to adapt in ways that organizational hierarchies would not succeed at?
That's great. And so among other things, David has led a number of innovation projects, and so I'm delighted that we've had the benefit of Sherry here, who specializes in innovation and is leading an innovation cell at a major American insurer. This, again, to David's point about unusual relationships or friendships, David and I recognized each other almost instantly as friends. That was after he was done explaining to me the SPY's Christmas door decorating contest. And through David have come many of the relationships that made this day possible, and I'll say notably the interaction with Peter Brooks, which has been so important in bringing forward the language in the statute and part of my education in this area. But Sherry, you've had the experience of innovating in several different contexts and are now facing a challenge as a business. People don't realize that one of the most important things about insurance isn't necessarily the premiums they take from you, but the ways in which they invest their capital assets. And so insurance is both a public good in terms of building resilience at the individual or retail level, but also a really important way that that society prosecutes these public goods both in pre-competitive and competitive modes. So maybe you can talk a little bit about your current assignment and your background and how it is you came to have an interest in this conversation.
Absolutely. So my background is in design. So I do not have a PhD. I knew I wanted to solve wicked problems and in new ways. And design, way back in the day, before there was things like lean startup and design thinking, it was in product design. And I don't know if I have any really great or stunning stories to tell, but I designed this microphone back in 2004. I could show you the sketches that I did. So it was kind of interesting to come in and see this here. And
The
so
best one I've
been
ever
resilient.
used.
Yeah. But also really understanding the importance of really talking to people to their face and understanding the real problems that they're facing every day, because it's really easy for us to make assumptions on what is the right thing to do. And I would say my most powerful design story is I developed an incubator baby warmer for GE. And they wanted something new to the world, and this is back when you could still like sneak into NICUs and look at the little babies and talk to the nurses. And I mean, we learned things that the medical company didn't realize because they'd never gone out and actually talked to the moms who were sitting there and the babies. And so we developed this brand new system that no one had seen. And I remember being out, I can't remember the exact instance, but a woman came up to me and she was crying and she said, I want to just tell you that I had a grandbaby and she only lived like 3 or 4 hours, but because of where we could put her for that amount of time, I got to actually see her and meet her. And so that was like the real, where you start to feel like, wow, design actually can solve some pretty wicked problems, whether it's, letting someone be with their grandchild for a few hours, or if you open the lens up to what we're talking about today. So the reason I'm here today is a serendipitous moment of meeting Molly, but I would have to say that upon meeting each other, we knew we would be fast friends. And within the group that I work at, we have multiple themes that we look at, where we can look at building new ventures, new businesses that can be funded either internally or externally that solve some of the wicked problems that our current customers or future customers might face. And because we have a line of business in farm, understanding that this is a space that, can affect the global system. But as we talked about in our breakout, there's real people with real plots of land and who rely on what's happening at that ground level for their livelihood. And so coming here, having a chance to have this, I wouldn't even say 30,000 foot, like 3 million foot view of all of the system thinking that's happening in this space, and how can I, with my skill set, then distill it down and put in all of these lenses where I can find a problem, a wicked problem for somebody in my sphere that I care about, where I can create something that's going to really be impactful to their lives. So that's me, and that's why I'm here. And I have to tell you, it has been extraordinary being in this room with such a diverse and incredibly intelligent group of people. So thank you for the invite.
Can I say something? Yeah, of course. I just want to say exactly what you said is once people see something that's hopeful, it completely changed their attitude. And what you said, David, is that it's really hard to convince anybody to change their thoughts. It's been proven, and in our world of media, is the most profitable part of media now, is to go extremely right or extremely left, because the group that believes what you are reporting about will stick with you and never go anywhere else. So being somewhere in the middle, which we've relatively remained the same at ABC, is that we're not the ones that are profiting big. These numbers of of media growth is huge on the far right and the far left. That's why it's great for me to report overseas mostly, to stay away from politics, because I don't have to impose this on anybody. Because we have also, how is it for me to try to sell getting on television important intellectual subjects like this is always a gigantic challenge, partly for that exact reason. What's happening with the environment, though, that until we get to the point of what the government, to try to convince people the government's got to do X, Y, or Z, people have to back more financing from the government, pay more taxes, all of that. Until we reach that point, people are intrigued by it and they want to hear what's happening in the world. The world wants to know about it, and we need to tell it to people. If people actually, as others have said, will people, if they learn that something needs to be solved, will they sacrifice or will they not sacrifice? If we can somehow give them a way that they can help this environment. So I did a whole series on Discovery called Focus Earth. We did stories where we went around the world to tell people what the problems are. I think this crashed these hours on Discovery that we're doing in 2008 when the market collapsed. So nobody wanted to hear the sad stuff anymore. But if we can go out there and say, and I'd love to hear stories about it, like you did with babies, for example, if you can make something that's really filled with hope, stimulating, then I think people will buy into it.
So I want to amplify what you both have said. We used to do world fairs, and that was a vision of tomorrow, and we've kind of stopped doing that. And I would love to see a world fair that incorporates what individuals can do to help adjust with what's coming down the turnpike, but is also a message of hope, because I think in some respects, with the whole climate change debate, you have the fact that for most of our history as a species, we met 80 people in our entire lifespan, and they were our immediate family members, and we had this immediate environment. And so the question for design is, how do you take this human brain that is not good at empathizing with things half a world away, let alone strangers, and encourage that empathy? But then two, I think there's a sense of learned helplessness that is pervasive in both the United States and most of the developed world, which is we all keep on looking for someone else to solve it. That's either government's job to fix it, or it's big business's job to fix it, or if I do something, I go on social media and I like something, which is not really doing anything. And so it is giving people something that they can tangibly see that they can do that gets them and their children and their relatives to that world of 2030, that world of 2040 that they want to have happen, as opposed to doom and gloom. If you do nothing, this is where we're going to go. And then they're left with, I'm angry or I'm fearful, but where do I channel that energy?
So I think this really raises a point that I'm channeling Liam Hutchison on my team. There's Liam. Liam, actually, everybody who came from Madison is a graduate of my systems thinking course. We've got Will Mulhern here, also an alum. And in systems thinking, we are we're relatively systematic about the ways in which we both scan to see things, and we will also look to see what isn't there. And we will emphasize that it isn't so much about answers, but really about the questions we ask. And I'm thinking of Liam in particular because his question, and Will before him, their question was, how can I make the biggest difference in the direction I feel strongly about? And of course, there's not an answer for that. But there is a tremendous power in that question. So we're about to say thank you to Liam and give him some breathing room through the summer, because he's going to go do experiments in doing, not thinking or talking. And I know for me, some of those experiments, notably working with a really, really challenged high school on the northwest side of Milwaukee, that wanted to become a high school of agricultural sciences. That experience, frontline 6-7 years, has really informed the ways in which we partner. I also believe the fate of those entering ninth graders who their median reading score is second grade, their fate is our fate as a nation. And reclaiming a relationship of that particular minority group to agriculture is also an incredibly healing thing. People say our adversaries go for our greatest strength. That is our civic fabric. And we talk about the way we structured the day. Emergency preparedness, a culture of preparedness, is a way people get to know each other. They have to work across boundaries and build a shared sense of what could happen and what to do about it. And I would be remiss if I didn't channel Bill Omican, because Bill makes the point about co-ops and the importance of that governance structure when we are thinking about shared risk and governance of shared risk, which in some sense this conversation all day today is about shared risk. What of this risk is Department of Defense's piece of this guy versus someone else's piece of this guy, government's piece of this guy versus the private sector's piece of this guy, the extent to which different skill sets and different life experience come together to create something far stronger than the sum of its parts. With an eye on the clock, I want to just give does anybody in the audience want to make any comments or, sorry, I didn't mean to catch you off guard, Alex. I just want to make sure, for those of you, every one of you has devoted the better part of a day, if not an entire day, to this experience. There will be lots of follow-up. We know that, but I want to make sure if anybody has comments or observations, thoughts, questions, we give you a chance to bring that forward.
Hi, my name is Erwin Villiger from iSciences. I just wanted to say, actually, something that kind of resonated with me with regards to food and the food system. When you mentioned about designing a incubator for infants, I recall a story coming out of Haiti after the Haiti earthquake, and an effort to try and make food resilience there possible, basically. And it really was somebody going down to the local grower, and in this case it was a woman who had either mango or papaya palms in her front yard, and she was trying to get food to the market where it would be aggregated and eventually, shipped to the United States. Problem was that it got there bruised. And so what was looked at was, well, how can we make her more productive by getting her a better quality product to market? And what they came up with was some kind of egg crate foam thing where she could pop papaya into it, get it to market. She had a better product. There was, a better quality, more food as a result. And it was a small thing, but it was a function of going out and finding where those small changes basically can make a difference, and also be workable, and applied across a whole community can make a big difference.
Yeah,
and sometimes that's those difficult things to get down to.
Right, not jumping from problem to solution, but really having clarity of the core of the problem so that you can slowly move to the right solution. And sometimes it doesn't have to be, this massive infrastructure. It's just, recycled cardboard boxes.
I wonder if Mel Cardova is still here. Is Mel here? I'm gonna just mention for any of you who didn't get a chance to speak to Mel. Mel is working very, very earnestly in Puerto Rico, and is very interested in the ways in which a focus on healthier food systems bring many, many positive attributes for the community as a whole, and the extent to which communities can build back way better. And I think the magnitude of the hardship in Puerto Rico, I should say failure, that's a touchy word, but the magnitude of the hardship in Puerto Rico, the lasting hardship, has been an arresting truth for our nation. And I learned in Dean School, never waste a good crisis. And I think we've had more than, as some of you have said, we have been lucky with regard to the crises we've faced, which isn't to say they're not really significant crises. It's just we could imagine far worse.
One thing I got to say just real quick about that same, I don't know what you've seen out there, but these countries, I've seen more and more impact investment that's happening in these countries. People that actually want to bring some money and invest in, somebody in their little neighborhood to create a company that will actually step up the supply of food to them, or more efficient way to distribute. It's amazing what's been invented in these little countries by people motivated by a tiny little company with a $1,000 investment from someone in America. I mean, I think we're seeing more and more of those around the country. I don't know if you experienced many of those, but they've been pretty successful in these countries. It's a remarkable return, and I'm not in the investment world at all, but I know I've seen it. And that's certainly one that seems to be an improvement.
Excellent. I'm looking for Anne. Is she here? Yeah. So I think with this, we're going to wrap this part of the program and give Anne Bowser the last word. And we'll invite you to a gathering after this. I'll just, while Anne's coming down, say my thanks to all of you, every one of you, the Wilson Center, to our sponsors, Holt Logistics and Refinitiv, and our anonymous donor, and to all of you for lending your time and talent. And this is not the last you've seen or heard of us. Thanks.
Thank you, Molly.
Thank you, Molly.
Thanks for the great panel. That was a breath of relaxation and some out-of-the-box thinking, which is exactly what we were hoping for with the zoom out approach. I'm going to keep my last words very short. I didn't prepare anything formal. I will just reiterate some of the things that I said this morning. The Wilson Center is a boundary organization accountable to the public sector, government, the academic NGO community, also working with stakeholders from the private sector, and we do systems thinking problems and build portfolios around different systemic risk pieces. So I think food systems and food security, but especially food systems, is a really good area for us to be able to support, and I'm incredibly pleased that we were able to work with Molly and Andrew and all of the other partners to convene such a thoughtful group of people with an action orientation to not only understanding but also moving these issues forward. So thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to continuing discussions informally across the street in the same dining room where you enjoyed lunch. We now have drinks and snacks. So thank you.